into the boarding houses set away from the more popular and expensive inns around Orc's Head Square. It was typical that on a night when they needed them most, the usual drunkards simply weren't around to hand their tithes and tips to those who needed them more. The cloaked head moved to look down the street. "I guess we'll have to find the not-so-usual drunkards," she muttered, scampered up the weaponsmith's roof, and slid into the valley where the workshop roof joined that of the smith's living quarters. She hoped none of the apprentices were having a sleepless night. It would only take one to realize that the soft sounds overhead weren't rats, and for the smith to call the guard. Moving silently, she ran along the ridgeline, threw herself across the intervening street, and twisted in midair to reach the roof of the clawed cup. When she landed above the kitchen gable, she dropped swiftly to her knees in case her movement had drawn attention. She rose into a crouch, pulled her hood lower, and moved to the shadows of the closest chimney. This time, she didn't settle against it. The clawed cup served meals late into the night, and the ovens were still active. The sweet smells of roasting pig made her stomach grumble. Annoyed, she told her body to shut its whining down. She looked back as her accompanying shadows descended the weaponsmith's roof to the alley below. A moment's wait was enough to confirm that they reached the street in one piece and undetected, before she turned and ran half-crouched along the ridgeline toward the tavern's entrance. When she reached the front of the building, she dropped onto her belly, edged closer to the eaves, and peered over. Her irises needed a moment to adjust. Warm light spilled from the tavern's windows, and sounds of rowdy enjoyment drifted up with the stink of ale and additional aromas of well-cooked food. The young woman's rebellious stomach ignored her earlier command and rumbled. She swallowed against a sudden surge of saliva. If she was quick, no, very, very quick, and lucky, they might all eat tonight. She only had to wait for the perfect moment. The tavern door cracked open, and bright light spilled into the street.
"And take your friend with you," Grunder shouted. "I've a good mind to call the watch." "No, no, no."
The voice that answered the barkeep sounded like its owner had enjoyed one too many ales.
"Let's—"
He paused for a moment before he continued.
"It won't be necessary."
A shadow swayed on the cobbles as the man who cast it was burdened by another whose arm he'd pulled over his shoulder. "Make that 12 ales too many," the girl thought, her grin feral in anticipation. Grunder had said friend. Did that mean there were only 2? She crossed her fingers. The shadow solidified and was then eclipsed by the figures of 2 solidly built men. Both wore chainmail tunics, leather breeches, and sturdy boots. Neither wore helmets, not that it would make a difference. From the look of them, and of the 2 who followed, they were professional soldiers, mercenaries who hired out to protect adventurers who wanted to ensure that they survived the journey into the doom. All wore belt knives, and 2 had swords strapped to their hips. One had a mace tucked crosswise through the back of his belt, and the 4th had an axe haft secured by a loop at his waist, the blade covered by a leather hood. The girl stifled a soft groan and ducked her head in case they had heard it. Her shoulders slumped. Why does it have to be mercenaries? Unfortunately, they were still the best marks she'd seen all night. A swift glance showed that the moon had almost reached its zenith. They were probably the only marks she would see that night. Given the sounds rising from the tavern, the other patrons were likely to be there until dawn, or would sleep on the tavern floor if Grunder let them. She pushed to her feet with a sigh, retraced her steps, and stopped to mark the target's trail before they wove out of sight. Her heart sank when she noted their size, and selected one slightly taller than the rest. The chances were he was the leader, and now her responsibility. Her gaze followed them as they turned away from Orc's Head Square and along the road that would take them past Steel and Shields, and possibly True Shot. Hidden in the shadow of her hood, a frown creased her brow. If they kept going that way, she had a very good idea of their destination. Slowly, she moved forward and tracked their progress by their heavy tread and the jangle of their weapons. They reached the corner and continued, and the girl breathed a sigh of relief, hurried to the end of the roof, and increased her pace as she approached. The mercenaries came into view, wove unsteadily past the front of True Shot, and continued. The girl smiled. There was only one doss house in that direction, and she knew a shortcut. After a low whistle, she stamped her foot hard on the roof, drew a deep breath, and raced forward.